everybody, welcome to another VOXOLOGY podcast.
Did you forget
Mike,
for a second?
I was
Where
like,
are we?
where are we? Well, recording Sunday morning, so I'm normally at a church teaching, and my whole like weekly structure is off. We were in the great state of Ohio for several days this past week. Kings Island, I don't know if you know of that amusement park. It is famous for its roller coasters, and Seth Erie did 11 roller coasters in I think 7 hours.
Holy moly!
Yeah, he went.
Who
he went
accompanies him on that?
Well, I did on a couple. Big Nate did on most or all, but Seth and I got front row on a very famous coaster called the Beast in the Midwest. It's a long wooden roller coaster that there's this thing that happens in Ohio between Kings Island and Cincinnati and Cedar Point in Cleveland. And they always have to top each other in terms of like the scariest roller coasters. So anyway, this is Seth's idea of a good time is to just sit and ride roller coasters over and over and over and over, and the scarier and faster the better.
Does it hurt you?
Partially.
We revisited some of there's an old one in Santa Cruz I grew up going to called the Big Dipper. It's an old wooden one, and it was the 100th birthday for it when we were there last time, so you could ride it for $1.
Nice.
And I rode it once, and then my neck and my back were just like,
totally.
All right, peace.
Totally.
I was like, man, I used to love these,
so
but now
true.
They just hurt so bad.
Yes. What's happened to us, man? Yeah. Stomach was fine. Neck, not okay.
Yeah, exactly.
So we're recording on a Sunday morning, and it's the Sunday morning after we bombed 3 nuclear sites in Iran last night.
Yeah.
So yeah, hot off the press. So we talked last episode a bit. I talked. Poor Tim said hardly anything. He didn't even have room. We talked a little bit about immigration, and we called it joyful, generous, peaceful, not
joyful,
compliant.
Peaceful, gracious.
That's right. And we had some questions about the joyful part of that.
Mm-hmm.
One of our dear friends said, "Well, you can say joyful, but you didn't feel joyful." and and so yes, there was a bit of intensity for both of us. Still is. But joy is one of those things that I know it's a weird word to put there, because you had a question about that, didn't you, Timothy?
Yeah, I was thinking about that question, and I think as my brain was just cycling through things, I was like, there's like this idea of sitting shiva with someone, right? Like as long as it takes, you sit in grief with somebody, and you're not sitting there trying to tell jokes to try to alleviate the situation or you're saying, I'm going to sit here and ride this wave with you as long as it takes.
Yeah.
Or I was even thinking about like when you tackled that person that was attacking the sports trainer on the field or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's not like you did that. You didn't use violence, but you subdued. And then it's not like you sat there and sang Kumbaya while people were waiting for, the authorities to arrive or whatever. So I feel like, again, often people are looking for, can you just tell me how to posture myself in this time period, in any time period? And I don't know there's always a static, like you just always posture yourself this way.
Yeah.
And then, and then you'll be doing the way that Jesus asked you to do it, or the God's looking for, or whatever. We're just like, I don't know. And so this time period is really pushing that forward. And so when your response last week, I was like, I thought that was authentic. And while there was emotion involved, it was emotion reacting to an informed position, if that makes sense. Like,
I hope so.
It wasn't like you were just like off the top of your head ranting about how you felt about it, which is what most of us do most of the time.
Yeah.
But this was an informed, kind of nuanced thing. So I was like, yeah, maybe there wasn't a lot of joy baked in there.
Yeah.
But I don't know that it always has to be.
Totally. And I think part of it is a very misunderstood but understandable misunderstanding about what joy means, right? Because joy isn't happiness. and it's not shallow optimism, and it's not covering things over. So much, the Greek word is related to the word charis, which is gift or grace. Mm-hmm. And so there's something to be said. And when I heard the phrase from Dallas Willard, joyful noncompliance, he's getting at the idea that because our hope isn't resting on the outcomes, which are totally outside of our control, we can actually have a settled, centered, non-reactive presence in places where most people would just be operating according to their, primal limbic systems. And so joy, yes. No, I thought you were asking a question. No, Tim raised his hand if you're watching on the YouTubes. And so for me, because another dear friend said, hey, maybe hopeful. And that would be a great word. Maybe it's hopeful,
but even that where we mess up.
Exactly. So for me, joy is more of the idea that we can sit in a settled state regardless of outcome, rather than happiness, which is entirely dependent upon circumstance. And so that's where I was going for it. Like there isn't a lot to be happy about, right, or optimistic about.
That is how we think of that word. Like
totally. And that's where, Paul will say things like, be joyful in all circumstances. He's not talking about feeling great there. So, or even, God loves a joyful giver. It's not because giving is just so fun. And I love to take, the income that I would rather hoard and store up and just give that away. It's not something that comes natural to me. And so a joyful giver is one who doesn't sit there and go, man, this is the best time ever. But one who sits and says, because I live in a God-bathed world, I don't have to be insecure as I give. You know what I mean? So it's
totally.
So to me, it's less about like when you're sitting Shiva with somebody, it's possible to do that joyfully because I'm here.
So it's almost like an assuredness.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking about that the other day in regards to the thing we've mentioned a bunch of times on here about the he is risen indeed. Like in the face of what feels like hopelessness, saying, hey,
yeah,
I'm going to lean into the assuredness of what I've found in whatever,
that's right,
in faith,
right,
in my faith, to say that looks like the world's on fire right now, and literally is on fire right now. But
totally.
Because what is an emotional, like a boulder of emotion rolling through something is not always.
That's right.
The most constructive or whatever, effective. Or,
that's right.
I know we don't like that word, but.
Yep. No, but that's it. I think that's it. And that's a very good question. I'm also thinking of Jesus's instructions to the religious leaders. But he tells them when they fast, don't disfigure their faces to make it obvious they're fasting. And so I think in my imagination, at least, there's a part of joyful noncompliance that isn't grudging or, like I'm drawing attention to it. I'm doing it in performative aspects. But I'm rather doing it because of how I see the world, how I see Christ in the world. And I also am lamenting and opening myself to the possibility for redemption in ways I can't anticipate. You know what I mean? So I just think there's
hard. Yeah. Such a hard posture to hold. The disfiguring your face thing, and also makes you think of like the hypocrites in the corner thing. Because now I feel like I'm seeing so much of that where it's like,
right.
The tearing of clothes and the open, like, kind of praying in a way, but without, because the little punk band that we started, the first song that we're putting out, I think it's called Love as Non-Compliance.
Ooh.
But because of writing that song, now I've been forced to really think about it and wrestle through what does that actually look like. And like I wrote the song in a flash, and so there's a lot of content in there on, but it's like love is very active. What does that look like in and it's amorphous almost in the way, like obviously it's like the love language. If you take that in your marriage and then put it to
that's right,
communal or global or whatever sense, how do you love in the way that love needs to be actively done in that specific place, right? So
You're right.
Loving my wife the way that she experiences and understands love, how do I take that idea and do that in a way that is pushing back against the systems in the world in the way that it is?
That's it. What you're identifying, which is so good, Tim, is that what the Bible describes as social realities, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, we as American Christians ascribe them to internal emotional states.
Ooh,
that is death, right? So love is a way that I feel towards somebody. Joy is a way that I feel towards circumstances, right? Peace is me not being anxious. And so we've taken this grand social literature, and we've turned it into just private emotional, feeling states of feeling.
Yeah.
And, so it's like give thanks in all circumstances, or rejoice always, and everything rejoice. We just think that's an emotional, and so I think you're onto something, Tim, because these are describing social realities. And so what does joy mean in a social reality? Well, I think it means attention to the other person. I think it means delight in the other person. I think it means assuredness that there are other factors in this relationship beyond just the two of us and our awareness and our wisdom. And so I can be joyfully non-compliant while totally lamenting and protesting the current state of things.
Yeah. Yep.
You know what I mean? That's
a very helpful distinction. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I think. That's because I've been thinking about it too, and so I'm really glad you brought that up. I think there's like a profound social reality that's being captured in the fruit of the Spirit that we've just turned into something.
That would be an interesting one to pick at, to go through each of those.
Let's pick
this is how we experience it, or this is how we manifest it, but this is what this means as a social reality, and through each of the fruit.
Even about like I made a list of all that's happened since our last episode, since you and I talked last. In terms of this, so we have the breaking out of hostilities between Israel and Iran, and obviously when we're recording last night, America joins that. We had the military parade. Great. We had the No Kings protests. We woke up that day to political assassinations, and all kinds, without even grieving the injuries, all kinds of speculation about who the shooter was, what the motives were, what political party they were. We have the launch of Trump Mobile, which is I thought was awesome in the middle of all this. Tim, I know you were a big Newsboys fan back in the day, or DC
this
Talk.
One just gets darker and darker,
right? And so we have this, and so if you don't know, there was a guy who was one of the founders of DC Talk named Michael Tate, who, after DC Talk disbanded, joined a band called the Newsboys, which when I was a youth pastor, these were sort of really big bands. And there's just a load of stuff coming out. You can Google it if you want to be depressed, about grooming and drug use and sexual assault. And because in our church community, we have folks that are in that industry, evidently that was an open secret that no one did anything about that we know of. And I was in one of those just burn it down sorts of moods, just like, okay, well then let's stop paying for music. Let's stop writing music to make money. Let's stop. Good Lord, it's just so freaking corrupt. It turns out our current president made $1.3 million from his Bible endorsement, which I thought was interesting. Mike Huckabee wrote an open love letter to our president, assuring our president he's going to hear from the voice of God. And then we had the weirdest, and I'm like, we're not commenting, we're just recounting what's happened.
Just in the last week.
Then we had the weirdest conversation between Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz.
Yeah.
And I don't swim in those waters, but Genesis 12 got invoked to justify American foreign policy, which has been true. And it's not just Genesis. It's a whole theological system we've talked about before called dispensationalism. But here is a great illustration, and you know this, Tim, of why theology matters.
I needed a jingle for that.
Oh, well, just imagine if somebody who was Muslim became president of the United States and was saying, listen, I'm running our foreign policy according to the dictates of the Quran, and the fit we would throw. And so just as a reminder, dispensationalism, one of the facets of dispensationalism, and this is totally in line with some of the left behind stuff, some of the eschatological end times prophecy stuff. One of the very distinctive theological pieces of this is that there is a distinct role for ethnic Israel still to be played. So let me just give you a quick kind of overview of this. And then I want you, if you haven't, to see this clip between Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz, where Ted is literally saying we have to uncritically support Israel because in the Bible it says those who bless Israel will be blessed and those who curse Israel will be cursed. And Tucker, and again, I don't know him, his interview style, whatever, was just saying, so really this government right now is what Genesis is talking about. And anyway, theology matters. It doesn't save us, but it certainly can harm us. Dispensationalists believe that the church and Israel are two separate things. Ethnic Israel is ethnic Israel, and the church is made up of Jews and Gentiles who affirm the messiahship of Jesus of Nazareth. Ethnic Israel, regardless of their belief in Jesus or not, still has roles to play in the future and promises that were made in the Old Testament to be fulfilled beyond just what Jesus did. Like that's a really, really huge point, particularly concerning regarding the land of Israel and the kingship of David. Those have yet to be fulfilled entirely or literally. They also interpret Revelation 20. We did a Revelation series, that there will be a millennial kingdom where God will reign over Israel, and Israel will reign kind of over the nations, and Israel will be central in warfare against the nations who are still hostile to God at the end of that. The church obviously has a place in God's plan, and Israel has a place in God's plan, but the two are not. They're parallel. They're running parallel to each other. And the big thing that dispensationalists will say about their view is, well, it just takes the Bible very literally. It just says, hey, this is going to happen to Israel. Well, it hasn't happened yet, so there must be a role. And there will be appeals, of course, to Romans 9 through 11, where Paul talks about ethnic Israel. And so God's plan and promises to Israel are still valid. It's an unconditional covenant to the tribe of Abraham. And so, bam, there you go. So that's how you get from Genesis 12 to Revelation 20 to American foreign policy.
You just covered the whole Bible in like 2 minutes.
I mean, it's that awesome.
Cover to cover.
And so, it just, we've talked at length in our Genesis series and in our Revelation series about potentially some of the flaws in that way of understanding things. For those theological nerds who are paying attention, I certainly agree that the church has not replaced Israel. I don't agree with that view. But I also, I call it, instead of like replacement theology, it's addition theology. Israel became, the word Israel now is not just boundaried into ethnic identity, it's affiliation to Jesus of Nazareth. So you can be ethnically Jewish and not believe in Jesus, but you're not part of the new people of God that was constituted by Christ, that he calls his church. So again, different view, but I don't think the church replaced Israel. I think Paul says like Gentiles were grafted into the Abrahamic family. It wasn't that there's the Abrahamic promise and then there's Jesus. It's that Genesis 12 promise that all nations will be blessed through Abraham's family has come to fruition in the church. This is what Paul seems to be arguing. But all that is to say, I'm grateful for those who simply throw out the rationale that many of us hold, that we should uncritically support the government of Israel because of this passage. And I think that is tragically mistaken. And I'm no expert on foreign policy, but what seems to be happening in Gaza, what seems to be some of the things that are being uncovered about the Netanyahu administration, and potentially some sort of invitation to the United States to get involved. I don't know that deserves our uncritical support. I think we can support Israel without supporting the Israeli government, in the same way we can support Iranians who are made in the image of God without supporting the Iranian government. So, minor digression there. One last thing that has happened since we last spoke non-joyfully, Tim, is that just back to immigration for a second. ICE's own detention statistics are proving the major point we were making. The justification for the deportation policies of the current administration is that we were being invaded by violent gangs. And instead of seeing pictures of ICE going into very gang-infested territories, we're seeing pictures of ICE going to Home Depot, going to Walmart, going to places where immigrant communities. What's that?
Gang havens.
Yeah, the gang havens of like international soccer clubs. And so I want to commend. This is from a immigration and customs enforcement paper called Detention Management, June 4th. The number of people who were arrested by ICE since January 11th by conviction status. Okay, so 71% of those people had no conviction at all. None. In fact, as we showed last episode, a lot of these are people who are trying to attain legal status, or they had legal status and then that was revoked. So the narrative that's being sold by the administration about the purpose of these deportations is utterly and completely false. Not only that, but when you look at the 29% of convictions, 7% are immigration-related crimes, 7% are traffic-related crimes, 7% are violence-related crimes. So 7% of the 29% are violent criminals. There are 4.5% of the 29% are vice, and then there's a category of other. So 7% of the 29% of people being detained have a violent, either current or violent criminal past. And so the narrative that's being used to justify the aggressive and that I would say overly aggressive tactics being used just simply isn't true by their own data. Now, again, we talk about the idea that, well, they're criminals because they're here. So they've already broken the law. So you can say, hey, there's no criminal conviction, but because they entered illegally, they're already determined to be criminals. So that's why they're being rounded up and deported.
So the other half of last week's title, we touched joyful and kind of what that posture looks like. But the non-compliance, I think, is also a difficult one to unpack. What does that look like? So even when we did the World Relief event, which everybody can watch
on
online,
the YouTubes, yeah, we should send that out to everybody.
Part of it, like you and Matthew Sorens were kind of like, hey, it's not lost on us that we're two white men having this conversation. But then, when the folks from World Relief got up right after that, one of the first things they said was like, hey, we need the white folks to speak out and to show allyship and to do some of the work that some of these communities can't do. Like, we need people using their privilege and their position to, I don't know why privilege is such a bad word, but we can do that later. But like like using that kind of stance, like it is a very important time period to use what privilege you have to highlight, to speak out, to do whatever. So the idea of the non-compliance feature of this too, I think, is another thing that has people kind of spinning out as like,
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to be compliant to what's happening.
Yeah.
Or complicit in what's happening. Yeah. But I don't know what that means. And so we talk about the meme with World War II with like the people that hit Anne Frank were breaking the law, and the folks that were knocking on the doors trying to get her were enforcing the law.
Right.
Law is not always just or moral.
Yeah, we're gonna.
And so I think we find ourselves in that time right now where we're seeing things that are being touted as legal and cracking down on crime and cracking down on all this stuff, but they are not just and they are not moral.
Right.
And so when we talk about, what does it mean to respect the government or whatever?
Yeah.
What does it mean to be non-compliant in this time period?
Okay. My friend, you don't know how great you are. Because that might be the greatest segue in the history of the world, Timothy. Because, and I joyfully click on responses to the positions we've articulated to hear what people are critiquing. And there's some great points that are floating around out there. One of the ones that isn't so great, in my view, is that people will just write Romans 13.
Yeah.
And that's it. That settles it. And what you're hinting at in terms of noncompliance, man, let's spend some time on. And to wrap the previous set of conversations into this one, let's look at Romans 13 as the text, in front of the text, and behind the text.
Because it's biblical,
on now.
Mike.
Come on now. And so we're going to meander through this. And there are parts that we'll look at that are just about the text. And then we'll make notes about behind the text and in front of the text. And if I were smart, I would have broken it down by sections in some linear way. But instead, I wrote it down by thematic points. And so in each of these points will be text behind the text, in front of the text. And I'll try to illustrate a bit of this as we go. With all disclaimers, there are people that disagree with this. And they think that you can just slap Romans 13 on any debate about immigration and say, okay, well, God has spoken.
Which got real big, like 2 elections ago, or?
Oh, bro, just wait. Yes. And so part of what we tried to do last episode was to make the positive case that the church, regardless of national or geographical boundary, should pay attention to the most marginalized, vulnerable communities. And one of those these days is a community that's being greatly scapegoated. Now we want to make the negative case that the way that Romans 13 is employed in this set of arguments is it's wrong theologically. It's wrong, which is the big point, but it's also wrong practically. And so, again, for your digestion, feel free to disagree. So let's read Romans 13 together, and let's just sit in it and take it seriously. 13 verse 1. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. I mean, that's a pretty major statement. If you rebel against authorities, you're rebelling against God. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong, they hold terror. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. That is also why you pay taxes. For the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. Let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. For whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. Boom. Couldn't be clearer, right? That's the text. And on the face of the text, I mean, how many times does he have to say it? The governing authorities have been instituted by God. Be subject to them. And then you internally will live at peace, right? And externally you will live at peace, because you don't have to be afraid of what the authorities would do to you. The authorities bear the sword of vengeance, and so obey them and don't get into trouble. And not only that, but God has established them. So, when it comes to immigration policies, they're clearly in violation of U.S. law, and so Romans 13 should apply. And Trump, literally, the immigration passages that we looked at, last episode. So that's the text, and we're going to get into in the text itself, in front of the text, behind the text. Let's start in front of the text to start. I come to this text and I want to acknowledge that it's applied inconsistently, just on the face of it. The people that I see appealing to Romans 13, I don't know that any of this is true, but I would love to go back and look at their posture towards Romans 13 as we went into lockdowns and mask mandates and COVID restrictions. There were a whole lot of people saying the government had no right to make us wear masks, and the government had no right to tell us to shut down our churches.
Yeah.
There, in those instances, something bigger than Romans 13 applied. And I would be curious about the consistency of people appealing to Romans 13 on immigration issues. Were they consistent in applying Romans 13 to COVID mandates, health mandates, stopping, saying the church shouldn't meet together for the sake of public health and safety? I'm also curious about Romans 13 when it was applied to, or if it was applied to, people who rioted on January 6th, assaulted police officers, vandalized a federal building, and then were pardoned by the current administration. Does Romans 13 apply to them? Just curious. And if not, why not? What about if the Bible or the government outlawed guns? We mentioned this last episode. Would the Romans 13 crowd use Romans 13 there to give up the guns? And I suspect perhaps there might be some resistance to that. Or what about the governing authorities in Iran or Afghanistan that Christians violate when they smuggle Bibles in or come in dressed as aid workers but are really missionaries?
Totally.
Does Romans 13 not apply? So in front of the text, before I've even looked at the text, I have to acknowledge that we're already, just in our practice, admitting there are times when Romans 13 applies and there are times when Romans 13 doesn't.
And does that go all the way down? This is really silly, but like all the way down to running a red light.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like if you're going to hold a really staunch posture on something, how
Totally.
far does that go?
Totally. So let's just acknowledge from the beginning that we don't apply it consistently. Consistently, we apply it according, sometimes, not always, to preconceived political positions.
Totally.
Secondly, behind the text is a bunch of other texts that commend disobedience to the authorities. And so you've got the very famous question posed to, the disciples when they're flogged, and ordered to stop proclaiming the risen Christ. It's not a question, it's a statement. We must obey God rather than men. But you also have, in the Bible itself, loads of examples of people disobeying the authorities that have been established by God. Mm-hmm. So, you start all the way back with Pharaoh in Egypt. And Pharaoh ordering the extermination of Hebrew infants. Here are the midwives who hide them, and they're commended and given large families by God for their actions. Rahab lying about the spies, the Magi not letting Herod know the details of their visit with the infant Christ. Daniel doing this balance between, I will accept the new name, I will live in Babylon as peacefully as possible, but when you declare that I cannot pray to the God of Israel, I will pray 3 times a day, and when I have to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar, I will not. And so you already have a more complicated theological picture if you're looking behind the text, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the greater posture of the Bible's teaching about governing authorities. Not only that, you have the earliest Christians refusing to, light incense in honor of the emperor, because that would constitute idolatry in their minds. Or the Christians that were persecuted by Nero after Paul wrote this letter. They were lit on fire, dipped in tar, used to light dinner parties. So Romans 13 can't be a carte blanche rubber stamp on everything governments do. And that is shown not only by our practice in using it inconsistently, but it's also shown by the other texts. And I'm just highlighting a few of the more obvious ones to give a very ambivalent view about government. Remember, Daniel and Revelation see government, the governments of the day, as beasts who devour.
Right.
So whatever Romans 13 means, it can't be a carte blanche approval for Christians to just obey whatever's being said. And I think most of us would see that automatically. You raise another point, and I think this point is an historical point in front of the text, but also in the text. And that is, legal does not equal moral. Illegal does not mean immoral, right? Legal and justice, those are 2 different things. So and your point about Anne Frank is totally profound. I was going to make it around slaveholders.
Juneteenth,
Yeah, exactly. To aiding a runaway slave was illegal. Mm-hmm. Slavery was legal, and Romans 13 was used to punish slaves. But now we would all look back and go, no, that had to be disobeyed because it was immoral. So legal does not equal moral. Just simply saying, well, illegal is illegal, guys, does not in any way historically settle any of the issues, because we're actually, as Jesus followers, we're called to justice, not legality. And so there are times that laws are meant to be broken in the name of some greater good. Now, when Paul calls, what?
Just want everybody to just chew on that for a second.
Oh, man. Again, this is just another instance of, we get the Bible, we get a verse we like, we slap it on any situation, and we go, that settles it. And anyone who doesn't agree with me is not being biblical. So
and should be punished.
Oh, totally. So
and that's kind of where we are now.
Well, at least in this issue we are.
Yeah.
At least in this issue we are. You also see, as we get into the specific text, when it says, let everyone be subject to governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. Now, it's very tempting in English to read that as, oh, okay, so God established the government of North Korea, the government of Russia, the government of the United States, the government of Afghanistan. God has established these particular governments. But if we're looking at the text, the Greek word here is tasso, and it has this wide range of meaning. It can mean like ordered. God has ordered government, or God has or it could also mean like ordering or filing library books, like you group like books with like books. I think what Paul's getting at in this Greek word is the idea that God has not established particular governments, but God has established a government role in order. If you go all the way back to Genesis, what God does is he brings order out of chaos. And so you have this primeval chaotic water that is just an ancient picture of nothingness that God then orders, right? He separates for the first 3 days, and then he fills in those separations in the next 3 days. It's all order. And you see this after, even after the tragic mistakes of the early humans, he's still ordering. Torah was order. Here's how you order yourselves, right? And so government plays a role in keeping chaos at bay. He's not in any way, shape, or form saying, oh, the Roman government is established by God.
So the beast helps keep chaos at bay.
Well, the good governments, right, keep chaos at bay. And that's where there's a very ambivalent posture towards government throughout the Bible. Because there are times, for instance, where Paul will appeal to Roman citizenship if he's being treated unfairly. Mm-hmm. And he wants to gain a hearing. And so he will use his Roman citizenship to appeal. But then there are other times Paul is accused of throwing the entire Ephesians economy into chaos because he's preaching another god than Artemis. And so there are accusations where Paul is a social disruptor, and then there are appeals he will make to Caesar. And so you see this ambivalence, even, in the book of Daniel, you'll see the same ambivalence of we obey where we can obey because we are pro order. But we disobey where we are called to disobey. So what you can't do is use Romans 13 to justify the specific actions of any particular government, because God has not established those particularities. He simply established that human beings, when they live in community together, will order themselves in certain ways that keep chaos at bay. Churches do this by having certain gifts highlighted, or eldership as overseers, right? We naturally try to order ourselves in specific ways. And we recognize that anarchy and chaos aren't natural states for human flourishing. So that's all that's being said here. And I, for one, am grateful for the positive role that government plays. The role that it ensures that people stop at traffic lights so that I can trust when the light turns green, I can trust that I can go. I'm happy that governments are prosecuting crimes and working against human trafficking, and we have no idea what it would be like to live, and not all of us, but in America at least, what it would be like to live in a place of complete anarchy where simple military power rules the day. So I'm grateful, at least for the specific way that government is expressed in America. But that does not simply give abject permission for Christians to affirm whatever the government does, right? We've made that point over and over. The other thing in the text that's interesting is this phrase, God's servant. So it says twice in Romans 13 that the governing authorities are God's servants. And that sounds really positive until in the text and behind the text, you do a study on how the nations are God's servants. And instead of coming up with, oh yeah, God approves of God's servants, it's actually the reverse, that God's servants are used to chastise Israel, and then they're punished themselves for chastising Israel with the sword. So let's look at this phrase, God's servant, for a little bit. In the Old Testament, God used secular nations to enforce covenant violations against Israel. The Old Testament calls many political figures God's servants, such as Cyrus, king of Persia, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the ruthlessly wicked nation of Assyria, which God calls the club of my wrath and the rod of my anger. So to say something is God's servant does not mean that God approves. It simply means that even the wicked fall in God's subjective and submissive will. In other words, even though governments think they are ultimate, they are not. So it's a way, instead of uplifting government, Paul is actually demoting it, using Old Testament language that described wicked governments used by God to chastise Israel. Does that make sense? Instead of saying, oh yeah, the government's God's servant, it's good. No. When you look at the ways that God's servant is used to describe the actions of certain nations in the Old Testament, all of those nations end up being punished because of their use of the sword. So in no way, shape, or form is that phrase a positive description of government. It's a demotion of government. It's putting government in its place. It's saying government has a very limited function in human society. And as long as it's fulfilling that very limited function, it's worth obeying for the sake of being peaceable people. Mm-hmm. But the minute it steps out of that very narrow, God-approved servanthood, right? Non-compliance becomes very much the worshipful posture of God's people. Are you with me on this? Mm-hmm. So, a bunch of points we've made so far. But let's look at the text, because it's interesting, Tim. Romans 13 comes after Romans 12. And what? Romans 12, I know. There's no like verse indicators or paragraph break between Romans 12 and Romans 13. I'm very thankful for the way that we can now reference, when I say this particular verse, I can reference Romans 12 versus Romans 13, 1 through 7 or whatever. But they really do, as we've talked about before, lead us sometimes wrongly into thinking these thoughts are separate, these sentences are separate, these paragraphs are talking about two different things. So Romans 13 is used to finish a thought that Paul begins in Romans 12. So in the text, let's look at the immediate context. So here's Romans 12. Verse 9, where he begins this unit of thought. Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good. So hate what is evil, cling to what is good. Interesting. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. So he's describing postures that we are to take within suffering and division. Because remember, he's writing to house churches, a series of house churches that are either divided in themselves or among themselves around ethnic identities. Gomes has a great stuff on all of this. Share with the Lord's people who are in need, practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. Here Paul is channeling straight the Sermon on the Mount, you could not, like almost word for word. Rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. So he's talking to divided people here. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Now, this is the thought that Romans 13 ends. This thought right here. Do not repay evil for evil. So yes, divided church, you're hurting each other. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. Okay, that is really important. So you're dividing, you're arguing. Do not repay evil for evil. And then he says the same thing another way. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. So did you see what he's saying? You're in the middle of conflict and division. Here are the ways that you were to treat each other. Love, hospitality, sharing, all the things. Do not repay evil for evil, and make sure that the way you're treating each other publicly shows that you are working hard to be at peace with each other, right? So he mentions for everyone, do good in the sight of for everyone. Like there's some audience he's worried about here. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. Okay? Now that's the thought that's going to lead us into Romans 13. Do not leave room for God's wrath. Do not take revenge. But then he inserts what the Christian posture is. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So that 25 different admonitions in Romans 12 to the church, right? Then he says, Romans 13, let everyone be subject to governing authorities. And when you juxtapose, and I know no one can see this as you're driving or walking or listening or whatever, but if you juxtapose 12:19, which says, do not take revenge, my dear friend, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. You juxtapose 12:19 to 13:4, where Paul says, for the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. Rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. So what he's saying is that governments do precisely what Christians are not allowed to do, namely to take vengeance. Do you see that? So he's prohibited the church from taking vengeance. And he says, leave room for God's wrath. In 13:4, he says one of the ways God exercises wrath is through governments. And so you see this with Israel. Israel would disobey, be filled with injustice. God will use as an agent of his wrath one of these foreign pagan nations, right? So God's servant is a demotion, but also he is saying that Christians, you are no longer allowed to take revenge. Allow for God's wrath. Oh, and by the way, one of the way God exercises wrath is through pagan nations, through the governments that wield the sword. Are you with me? So rather than saying, hey, Christians, look at Romans 13, here's how we have to act, Paul's saying, nope, Christians, you're Romans 12 people. Pagan nations are Romans 13. And insofar as you obeying Romans 12 doesn't conflict with you obeying Romans 13, then be at peace with everybody. But if Romans 12, your commitment to Romans 12 conflicts with your commitment to Romans 13, then Romans 13 goes out the window.
Yeah.
Right? Like he's deliberately setting up a contrast that is missed by me and the vast majority of evangelical Christians, where he's saying, listen, and from this text, the earliest Christians prohibited military and government service. How can you obey Romans 12 and be a part of the government wielding the sword at the same time? The sword in Romans 12 is forbidden to you. So, I mean, far from just giving carte blanche to whatever governments are saying, right? I mean, we are in the weeds of all sorts of qualifications and insight into how God's people are to relate to the state. Can God use the nation state in his purposes? Yes. And so when it's a force for good, obey and give honor and pay tax. But when it's not, Romans 12 wins. Come on.
It's so interesting, though, because it's like we're at such a divided place now that even the way that people would define each of those categories would be different.
Mm-hmm.
Like what is good and what is not.
Totally. That's right.
I have some questions.
Okay, are
we in a question spot?
One
of the things that popped in my head is God hardening the Pharaoh's heart.
Yep.
Does that kind of stuff play into this with pagan nations?
Absolutely. Romans 9. So Esau Macaulay makes a great point about if God established Pharaoh, then actively works to undermine Pharaoh, what do you do with that? Yeah. And so remember, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart is really interesting because 10 times Pharaoh hardens his own heart and actually begins that cycle. 10 times God hardens Pharaoh's heart. And so I think this is an instance where God gives us over to what we're doing, right? This is the Romans 1. He gave us over 3 times. It says, God gave them over, God gave them over, God gave them over. This is exactly that scenario.
Yeah. Blessed are the peacemakers. So I think like going into this time period too, that when you look at non-compliance in some of these settings with what is just and what is not, we did stuff years ago on the difference between peacekeeping and peacemaking.
Yeah.
looking at what peace, because we're looking at, a lot of the stuff is looking at a top tier government level, right?
Yeah.
And kind of the actions of the government, how the government does what it does. But for taking that all the way down to the individual or the community that's listening to this, like, what does peacemaking look like as non-complaint? So I was thinking about when I went to this immigration event about a month ago or so. And I think I mentioned this already, but it was an interesting idea. This group of people who helps advocate in our area, and it's mostly younger Hispanic women that are running it. And so they were talking about kind of like, here's what you're right, similar to what we do with World Relief, but just through a more of a, non-biblical version of it, or at least not rooted in that. Advocating for like, here's how you can help your community out and help keep them safe, right? So like a silly example of this, but I'd never thought about it, was like, offer to help fix the taillights of Hispanic families, so they're not getting pulled over for a taillight and then getting taken for something else, right? So like these weird little practical things that you're not even breaking the law, you're just serving your neighbor and helping to create. Does that make sense? Like I'm trying to find these ways in which peacemaking, because that peacemaking feels like the thing right now.
Yeah.
Like we are just like, whether it's Iran or what's happening in Gaza or what's happening on the streets of LA or what's happening anywhere, like we are in the absence of peace.
Within families, within churches, within
That feels like to me right now, like that's the alarm that's blaring, is like we are as far from peace as possible.
Yeah.
So what does it mean to be a peacemaker in the face of what's happening currently in our country, our neighborhoods, whatever? That's what I'm wrestling with the most right now. Because it's one thing to have like theological discussions about it, or to have ideas about, well, this is how it should be, and then going on our way. It's like, no, we have a part to play. What is that? And it's not taking up arms against our aggressors or whatever, but there is an active stance to be held and taken in this time. What is it?
Yes.
And I don't know the answer.
Would you hate me if I said joyful, generous, peaceful noncompliance?
But it's a lot to play with, right? Because what is that really like? So you helped establish what joyful. No, but you're right. But that's it, right? Like, where I went to a dinner last night at a church that is just like VOXOC, like just a community of no employees, no nothing, just a community of people who want to get together and do things together and live life together and reach out in the community. But there's a lot of those conversations. Could be while we're having dinner, the bombing news came through, right? So it's like you're faced with the harsh reality of what is happening actively. And so having a passive response to active threats just feels very superficial.
Right. And that's one of the differences between peacekeeping and peacemaking, right? Peacekeeping can be very passive. Peacemaking is very, very active. When you're agitating, absolutely. And I don't have great responses right now. For me, part of peacemaking is making sure our local community is involved with the refugee community, which is happening. Wanting to do public events with World Relief and getting kind of their perspective out there. Trying to do deep dives into some of the language that's used by people in power that I don't think fits the posture of the Romans 12 kind of community, particularly as it's bathed in God talk. I mean, even last night, there was this very kind of weird thing at the end of the president's press conference about this, and I wrote it down verbatim. I just want to thank everybody, in particular God. I thought
this was AI when I saw it.
I want to just say we love you, God, and we love our great military. And I mean, okay, it's just, but it's when does the church like do and say? And I think there are two places where the church does and says. It's idolatry and injustice. So idolatry is when the government overreaches from this very narrow lane that it's to have. And so some of the God talk being used overreaches. It's a claiming for itself anointing. Even the Huckabee love letter to President Trump was drenched in God talk.
The fact that he made $1.3 million off of a Bible.
Totally. Mr. President, God spared you in Butler to be the most consequential president in a century, maybe ever. The decisions on your shoulders I would not want to be made by anyone else. You have many voices speaking to you, sir, but there is only one all caps voice that matters, his all caps voice, meaning God. I am your appointed servant in this land. I am available for you, but I do not try to get in your presence often because I trust your instincts. No president in my lifetime has been in a position like yours, not since Truman in 45. I don't reach out to you to persuade you, only to encourage you. I believe you will hear from heaven, and that voice is far more important than mine or anyone else's. So when I look at that, and you can say, hey, Biden did it in his own ways, great. Okay, let's go talk about that. But I didn't hear this kind of overreaching language from the Biden administration. No. God spared me. You're going to hear God's voice. This from the ambassador to Israel. I've just noncompliance by the church and the prophetic calling out, and maybe that's what you want to explore more, is what does prophetic sort of protest look like here? And that's really a worthy conversation. I think that's a great combo. But whenever there's idolatry, that the government is claiming for itself, either through language or action, prerogatives that are reserved for Jesus of Nazareth alone. Jesus is Lord. Or injustice, when the government promotes injustice. In those cases, the church has an obligation to live in this posture of joyful, peaceful, gracious noncompliance. And so I think we're seeing both here in this particular issue and other places. And so part of what noncompliance looks like, and it starts by, is just telling what's true. It starts with just naming truth. Hey, the government is saying we're getting rid of all these criminals, but what's happening is exactly the opposite.
You heard it said.
But yes. And so it starts there. And in terms of like where we should adjust where our money goes and where time's spent and, all of those sorts of things. And I don't have great insight into these things. All I know is there are national organizations that I'm going to support. There are local organizations I'm going to support. And then if I have the opportunity to participate in ways that can help the immigrant community practically, I'm all in. I'm all in. And though that could be taillights, that could be meals, that could be, we've just started thinking about what happens if ICE shows up at our church. What's that look like? What's our posture to that? And those sorts of things, So I'm with you. And I love, Tim, the thing I love about you, and one of the reasons why you're so good for me, and many others, I think, is because you keep pressing. I'm great. I love ideas, and I see how ideas matter and how they harm and how they help. And so I live in that kind of world. But you're the dude who shows up at school board meetings. You're the dude that advocates for somebody getting on a school board to help balance out some of the nonsense of the particular school board in your community. And that's where, man, keep pressing into what's this look like, because I don't know. Beyond the things we just mentioned, I don't know.
That's the weird thing too, is like you just talked about the posture that we're being asked to hold. And I think that you watch how as generations shift or time periods shift, the posture remains the same, but the way that you act from the posture, that can be different.
Yes.
Right. And then I know it's a no-brainer, but I think we lose that sometimes, where it's like how you get your hands into what you're standing up against or whatever will change. The posture doesn't change. I think we've been told that the posture changes,
right,
through time and different things.
Yeah.
But the last question I have, we don't have time to do it now, but I'm so curious about how reading Romans backwards works with a lot of those verses too.
That's it. This is a pastoral issue. Paul's not giving See, and this is where, this is such a huge point. So Reading Romans Backwards is a book we recommend. Scott McKnight. There are some other great books on Romans, but they make the point that Paul isn't giving a systematic theology on anything. I was always told Romans is Paul's theology textbook.
Mm-hmm.
And so whatever Paul says in Romans sort of overrides the rest of what Paul says anywhere, because this is a systematic theology. And the point of the Reading Romans Backwards, folks, is that no, this was a pastoral letter occasioned by a deep crisis of division within the Roman house churches around Jewish identity. Gambas has done a Roman series. His thoughts are magnificent around this. Get McKnight's book. But the point is, we, instead of reading Romans as if it were a treatise in theology, so we start at chapter 1 and go forward, a better way to read Romans is to realize how Romans ends. That's what he was employing all the theology to drive to. And what he's driving to isn't at all a theology of eternal life or justification by faith. Rather, he's employing those topics to argue for the unity and the peacefulness of the Roman house churches with each other.
That's so big.
It's so big. So big. All right, I have approximately 9 more notes on Romans 13. We will not do them now. Our audience has suffered enough. We've had literally dozens of people awaiting our response on this. So most of them are from our own families. Most of them are Seth Erie, to be honest. He was very thrown off today by the fact that we're recording on Sunday while he's at church. And yeah, it's really hard. We spent probably half an hour on that last night.
It's all just anarchy. There's no rules
here.
Hey,
Les, guys, this is an order. You record on Friday. It's released on Monday. We do a sermon on Sunday. Totally. So anyway, my friends, thanks. We love your thoughts, and we're so honored as always to be a part of this community. So, more to come.
Mordecai. Thank you for listening to this conversation. The VOXOLOGY podcast is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that is made possible by listeners just like you. If you'd like to partner with us, you can do so at patreon.com/VOXOLOGY podcast or on Tithely, tithe.ly, and just search VOXOLOGY podcast. Links for both are in the show notes and on our website. You can interact with the hosts on Facebook /VOXOLOGY podcast or on Instagram at VOXOLOGY podcast and on Twitter or X, whatever it is, at Mike Erie. Thank you for walking this long road with us.